My dad lied about being sick to skip my wedding and be with his new wife instead. He then sent me a check as apology. I mailed it back along with the truth that destroyed his new family. Weddings were supposed to be about joy, love, and unity. Or at least, that's what I always believed. Ever since I was a little girl, I dreamed of my father walking me down the aisle. The image was crystal clear in my mind. My dad in a sharp suit, his arm steady under my hand, smiling at me like I was still his little girl, even as he gave me away to the love of my life. That dream carried me through some of the tougher years of my life, especially after my parents divorced and my dad remarried. Planning my wedding wasn't easy. Balancing a tight budget with my vision for the perfect day was exhausting, but it was worth it. My fiancé, Matt, was my rock throughout the process, cheering me on when I started to feel overwhelmed. We wanted the day to reflect our love story, full of little personal touches, handwritten vows, a DIY photo booth, and my mom's homemade cookies as party favors. Everything was coming together, except for one small hitch: my dad. When I first told him about the wedding, his reaction was lukewarm. He said he was happy for me, but there was something about his tone that felt off, like he was going through the motions. I brushed it aside, thinking maybe it was just awkwardness. After all, we weren't as close as we used to be, and his new wife Laura and her daughter Carly had seemed to monopolize most of his attention over the past few years. Still, I was determined to include him. I asked if he would walk me down the aisle, and his response made my heart ache. He said he'd try his best, but he couldn't promise anything because of his health issues. It wasn't the definitive yes I'd hoped for, but I convinced myself it was enough. At least he was considering it. As the big day approached, I kept following up with him, asking if he'd be able to come. He kept dodging the question, saying things like he needed to see how he felt closer to the date, or that he had some tests coming up. I wanted to believe him, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called him again. I was practically begging at this point, asking him if he could at least confirm whether he'd be there. His voice was low, almost apologetic, as he said he didn't think he could make it. He claimed his arthritis was acting up and that the travel would be too much for him. I tried to be understanding. I told him I'd arrange transportation and even offered to pay for a comfortable car service or book a hotel near the venue so he wouldn't have to worry about the drive. He said it wasn't about the logistics, it was about his health. He didn't think he could handle the stress. Hearing those words broke something inside me. I wanted to scream to demand that he try harder, but instead I swallowed my pride and told him I understood. I didn't want to guilt trip him. He was my father, and I thought the least I could do was be gracious about his decision, even if it hurt. The day of the wedding was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. My mom was radiant, bustling around and helping with last-minute details. Matt was everything I could have hoped for, steady, calm, and so full of love. But as I walked down the aisle with my mom by my side instead of my dad, I couldn't help but feel a tiny bit sad. I scanned the room, half hoping he'd show up at the last minute, but his seat was glaringly empty. The ceremony went off without a hitch. People laughed, cried, and cheered us on as we said our vows. It should have been the happiest day of my life, but there was a part of me that couldn't stop thinking about the man who wasn't there. A couple of days after the wedding, I was scrolling through social media when my heart dropped. There he was, my father, the man who was supposedly too sick to travel, posing on a sunny beach with Laura and Carly. The caption read something about a family getaway, complete with heart emojis and hashtags about bonding and relaxation. I stared at the photos, my hands trembling. There he was, grinning ear to ear, holding a fruity drink in one hand and giving a thumbs up with the other. Laura looked like she was having the time of her life, and Carly was posing in a new bikini, carefree and happy. It wasn't just one photo. There were dozens of pictures of them on a yacht, eating at fancy restaurants, exploring scenic hiking trails. All of it was during the same weekend as my wedding. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just that he hadn't shown up. It was that he had lied to me, concocting some excuse about his health while he was off enjoying a vacation with his new family. The tears came before I could stop them. I felt like a fool, bending over backward to accommodate him, believing his excuses and even defending him when others questioned his absence. He hadn't just let me down. He had chosen them over me. It made it clear where his priorities lay. I showed the photos to Matt, who was just as furious as I was. He held me as I sobbed, whispering words of comfort, but it did little to ease the ache in my chest. My dad hadn't just missed my wedding. He'd actively avoided it, choosing to spend that time with people who hadn't been in his life nearly as long as I had. For days I debated whether to confront him. Part of me wanted to call him out to demand an explanation, but another part of me was too exhausted to fight. I kept replaying our conversations in my head, analyzing every word he'd said, trying to figure out how I hadn't seen through his lies. I didn't know what to do. Update 1. I wasn't sure how to process it. My emotions oscillated between anger and sadness, and sometimes an unsettling numbness. Matt encouraged me to talk about it, but every time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain to someone that your own father made you feel disposable? The first time I heard from my dad after the wedding was a week later. He called his voice overly cheery, as though he could gloss over the fact that he had missed one of the most important days of my life. He started by asking how the wedding went. His tone was casual, as if he were asking about the weather. I gave him a clipped response saying it was fine, but I didn't elaborate. I didn't owe him a detailed recount of a day he chose not to be a part of. Then he said he wanted to give me a gift. He said he felt bad for missing the wedding and wanted to make it up to me. His exact words were something along the lines of, "I know I couldn't be there, but I hope this will show you how much I care." I should have felt some semblance of gratitude, but instead, I felt a deep, simmering anger. It wasn't the kind of anger that made you lash out in the moment. It was colder, sharper, the kind that sank into your bones and refused to let go. I asked him what the gift was. He said he'd send me a check, a little something, to help us start our married life. That was when I lost it. I told him I didn't want his money, that no amount of cash could make up for what he did. He tried to argue, saying he wasn't trying to buy my forgiveness, just show that he cared. But his words rang hollow. If he cared, he would have been there. If he cared, he wouldn't have lied to me. When I brought up the photos, his tone shifted. He stammered, trying to explain. He said the trip was planned last minute, that Laura had booked it as a surprise and he didn't know how to say no. He tried to justify it, claiming he didn't realize it conflicted with the wedding until it was too late. The lies only made me angrier. I reminded him that I had called him multiple times, practically begging him to come, and he had let me believe his health was the issue. He had let me feel guilty for even asking while he was off sipping cocktails on a beach. He tried to shut me up by saying it wasn't what it looked like, that the trip was a family obligation. That word obligation set me off. I asked him if he thought walking his only daughter down the aisle wasn't also a family obligation. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then he said something that truly broke me. He claimed he thought I'd understand. He said, "You're so independent, so strong. I didn't think you'd need me there." It was like a punch to the gut. My independence, my strength qualities I had worked so hard to cultivate, had been twisted into excuses for his absence. I told him that being strong didn't mean I didn't feel pain, and being independent didn't mean I didn't need my father. By the end of the call, I was drained. He kept trying to smooth things over, but I told him I needed time and hung up. The check arrived a few days later. It was tucked into a Hallmark card with a generic message about love and happiness. There was no personal note, no heartfelt apology, just a dollar amount that felt more like an insult than a gesture of goodwill. Matt asked what I wanted to do with the money. He said we could put it towards something useful, like paying off a bill or saving for a future trip, but I couldn't bring myself to cash it. Every time I looked at the check, I felt a wave of anger and sadness. To me, it wasn't a gift. It was a bribe, a way for him to absolve himself without actually taking responsibility. I decided to return it. I wrote a short letter explaining why, careful to keep my words measured. I didn't want to lash out or say something I couldn't take back. I simply told him that what I needed wasn't money. It was his presence, his support, and his honesty. And since he couldn't give me those things, I couldn't accept his check. Sending that letter felt like taking a small piece of my power back. I didn't expect him to respond, and he didn't. For a while, things were quiet. I threw myself into married life, focusing on building a home with Matt and finding joy in the little moments. But the hurt lingered, a dull ache that refused to fade. The real fallout came a week later. My aunt, who had always been close to my dad, asked why he hadn't been at the wedding. I told her the truth. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I simply stated the facts. Word spread quickly. Relatives started calling me, offering their support and expressing their outrage. Some even confronted my dad, demanding to know how he could do such a thing. He wasn't happy about it. He called me furious, accusing me of airing our family's dirty laundry. He said I should have kept it private, that I was being vindictive by sharing what happened. I told him that I wasn't responsible for protecting his reputation, especially when his actions were the problem. I reminded him that I had given him every opportunity to make things right, and he had chosen to lie and avoid accountability. The conversation ended with him saying he needed time to think. I knew I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't force my dad to be the man I wanted him to be. All I could do was set boundaries and protect myself from further hurt. Update 2. A couple of weeks had passed, and it seemed like the storm had calmed. The phone calls from concerned relatives had slowed to a trickle, and Matt and I were starting to settle into a routine in our new life together. The weight I'd been carrying felt a little lighter, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I could breathe without feeling constantly suffocated by the past. But just when I thought I could finally move on, my father showed up at my doorstep unannounced. It was a Sunday morning. Matt had gone out for a run, and I was curled up on the couch reading a book and savoring the quiet solitude. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. My heart sank before I even opened the door. When I saw him standing there, emotions I hadn't dealt with in weeks resurfaced: anger, sadness, a sharp, aching disbelief. There he was, my father, the man who had failed me, standing at my doorstep like he had every right to be there. He looked different, smaller somehow. Maybe it was the guilt I could see weighing on him, or maybe it was that for once I wasn't looking at him through the lens of blind devotion. He wasn't my larger-than-life father in that moment. He was just a man, vulnerable and flawed. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes uneasy, as if he knew he didn't belong there. He asked if we could talk, and his voice was subdued, lacking the bravado he'd always carried before. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to slam the door in his face and protect my peace. But something inside me, a lingering sense of duty or curiosity, made me step aside. I motioned for him to come in. He hesitated for a moment before walking in, sitting awkwardly at the edge of the couch like he was afraid of taking up too much space. I couldn't help but notice the shift. I was no longer a child waiting for my father to show up and make everything right. I was an adult, and for the first time, I felt like I held the power in this relationship. This wasn't a father-daughter conversation anymore. This was a reckoning. He started with an apology, saying he regretted missing my wedding and admitting he'd handled everything poorly. His words sounded rehearsed, and I could tell he was trying to make it sound like he understood how badly he'd hurt me. But it didn't take long for him to fall into his old habits, trying to justify his actions. He talked about the stress of blending families, how Laura had pressured him to prioritize her daughter, and how he felt torn between two worlds. I listened, my arms crossed tightly across my chest, not out of defensiveness, but because it was the only way I could keep myself from losing control. I didn't interrupt him, not at first, but inside I was seething. His excuses didn't move me, not even a little. In fact, they only made me angrier. He wasn't owning up to anything. He was deflecting, trying to share the blame with everyone but himself. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to absolve him, to tell him that I understood. But there was no forgiveness coming from me. Not today, not ever. I told him I heard what he was saying, but I needed him to understand something. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about a pattern of behavior that went back years. He'd always put other people ahead of me, Laura, her daughter, even his own pride. And I'd always tried to make excuses for him, tried to understand, but I couldn't do that anymore. He started to interrupt, but I held up my hand, silencing him. I wasn't finished. I reminded him that he lied to me, telling me he was too sick to be there for me on one of the most important days of my life. Then he tried to cover it up with a check, as if my feelings could be bought. Did he have any idea how that made me feel? Like I was worth less than a vacation, less than a lie. He looked away, his jaw tightening, but I could see the faintest glimmer of guilt in his eyes. For a moment I thought he might apologize, but instead he doubled down on his defense. He told me he didn't mean to hurt me, but I had to understand he was in a difficult position. Laura was putting pressure on him to prioritize her daughter. I cut him off, telling him this wasn't about Laura, this was about him. He made a choice. He chose her and her daughter over me, and he'd been doing it for years. He always chose everyone else, and I was always left behind. At some point, he needed to take responsibility for that. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment he said nothing. I thought maybe he'd finally see the truth. But when he spoke again, his voice was defensive, as if he were the one wronged. He told me he'd always tried to do right by me. Maybe he made mistakes, but he was only human. I acted like he was some kind of villain, but he had done the best he could. I shook my head. His best wasn't good enough. If he couldn't see that, then maybe he wasn't ready to have this conversation. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with frustration. He said he came here to make things right, but it seemed like I wasn't interested in hearing him out. I stood up too, my heart pounding, and told him I'd been hearing him out my entire life. All it had gotten me was disappointment. If he wanted to make things right, he had to start by being honest with himself. Until then, there was nothing more to say. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. When Matt came home, I told him everything. He listened quietly, nodding. His expression a mixture of sympathy and barely contained anger. He said I'd done the right thing and that setting boundaries was crucial even if it hurt. His support meant everything to me at that moment. Update 3. The next day my aunt called. She told me my father had gone to her house after leaving mine, unloading all his frustrations. He told her I was being unreasonable, holding a grudge, refusing to let him make amends. A fresh wave of anger hit me. It wasn't enough for him to hurt me. Now he was trying to paint himself as the victim. That's when I made a decision. I needed to take control of the narrative. I posted on the family group about the fallout. My dad was furious when he found out, but at that point, I didn't care anymore. I was done letting him control this story. I laid it all out, every lie, every excuse, every broken promise. I told them about the wedding, the fake health issues, the photos, and the check. I explained how his actions had made me feel and why I had chosen to set boundaries. To my surprise, most of my relatives were supportive. They admitted they had seen how my father had been prioritizing his new family over me, and they agreed that his actions were hurtful. My father, of course, was livid. He accused me of trying to turn the family against him, of airing our private issues for everyone to see. But I stood firm. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. He'd spent years avoiding it, but I was done enabling that. If he wanted to fix this, he needed to take a hard look at himself. In the days that followed, I received messages from relatives who previously didn't know about the situation expressing their support. Some even told me they'd confronted my father, urging him to make things right. Whether or not he would listen, I didn't know, but the burden was no longer mine to carry. Update 4. When I saw Laura's message, my blood boiled. The audacity, the complete lack of empathy. I stared at the screen, reading her words again and again as though hoping they'd change. But no, it was just another attempt to paint my father as the victim, another guilt trip packaged in polite language. She was telling me I should be grateful for my father's attempts at reconciliation, as though his attempts to buy his way back into my life could somehow make up for years of abandonment and vacationing on my wedding. Matt could see the fury building in me, and he came over to read it too. He shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. She's acting like your dad hasn't done anything wrong." I stood up. "She's just like him," I said, my voice cold. Another one of his replacements. That was it. The word that felt like it fit perfectly: replacement. Laura wasn't just playing the role of the beautiful stepmother. She had become the perfect image of what my father wanted: someone who didn't challenge him, who never questioned his actions, a woman who just slotted herself into the role my mother once occupied right alongside his new daughter. It made my stomach churn. The thought of her and her daughter trying to replace me and anyone else who had dared to stand up for themselves. I sat back down, not able to shake the tightness in my chest. I had to respond, but it needed to be done carefully. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keys, and I typed, letting the truth spill out in every word. I started by calling her exactly what she was: a replacement. I told her that she had swooped in and tried to take my place, and that in doing so, she had stolen more than just my father's attention. She had stolen a chance at a real family for both of us. I reminded her that she wasn't even my father's first choice. He'd walked away from everything I had once known in favor of this new life. And now she was part of the team that kept him from ever having to face the consequences of his actions. She hadn't just married my father. She had helped him destroy everything we used to have. I didn't hold back. I told her I had always been the one left in the dust while she was playing house with a man who had no interest in me. It wasn't even about her anymore. It was about the fact that she and my father had somehow managed to make me the villain for standing up for myself, for calling out lies. And that was something I could never forgive. Then I went even further. I wasn't about to let her think she had any right to lecture me on what I should feel or how I should handle my father's actions. I told her with absolute certainty that she would never understand the pain I felt, not until she experienced the same betrayal. I said I hoped that one day her child would feel the same way I did, that they would find themselves standing at a threshold waiting for their father to show up only to have him choose someone else. I wanted her to see how cold and indifferent that felt, to know what it was like to be replaced, and to understand what it really meant to have someone you trusted completely walk away from you without a second thought. I told her that only when it happened to her would she understand the magnitude of what my father had done to me, to us. And I meant every word. I wanted her to feel that pain, the same pain that had driven me to this point of no return. The message was long, but there was no hesitation in my heart as I hit send. I didn't care what she thought of me anymore. I had been patient, I had been understanding, and I had been hurt beyond measure. I wasn't about to allow anyone to rewrite this story or act as if I was the one in the wrong. Not now, not ever again. Matt, having read the whole thing over my shoulder, nodded quietly. Well, that should do it, I smiled thinly. Good, she needs to know exactly where I stand. Update 5. I had made my decision. My father wasn't welcome in my life anymore. The conversation we'd had, the one where I told him I couldn't do this anymore, had been the final straw. Matt supported me every step of the way. Weeks passed and the initial sting of my decision began to fade. I focused on the future, on building a life with Matt that didn't involve the emotional chaos my father had brought into it. He tried to call a few times, but I never picked up. He sent a few texts, but I ignored them. I wasn't interested in hearing anything he had to say anymore. It wasn't until 2 months later that I got a call that made my heart skip a beat. It was a number I didn't recognize. Hesitant, I answered. On the other end of the line was Carly, my father's stepdaughter, his second wife's daughter, from her previous marriage. I hadn't spoken to Carly in years, and to be honest, I wasn't sure if I had any desire to talk to her either, but I couldn't ignore the desperation in her voice as she began speaking. She asked if I knew where her father was, and I could barely make out her words through the shakiness of her voice. She went on, her words broken, explaining how her dad had suddenly left a month ago. She hadn't heard from him. Not really. He'd sent a couple of texts here and there, but nothing substantial. She was frantic, not knowing where he was or what had happened. Then she told me something I wasn't prepared for. This morning, her mother had received divorce papers. He hadn't even called, just sent the papers. I couldn't help myself. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. The absurdity of it all just hit me. After everything, after years of excuses and hurt, he was doing this again. But this time, it wasn't me he was abandoning. It was Carly and her mother. And as much as I hated to admit it, a small part of me felt satisfaction. Maybe it was the dark humor in it, or maybe it was just the culmination of all the pain he'd caused finally coming full circle. Carly, of course, didn't understand. She heard me laugh and paused, a long silence stretching between us. She didn't know why I was laughing. She couldn't, but I couldn't stop myself from repeating the words my father had once told me. I told Carly maybe she should stop being so dramatic. I said it wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't the first time he'd left, and it wouldn't be the last. I wasn't going to apologize for my feelings, not when he had hurt me the way he had. The silence on the line grew longer. Carly kept asking why he would do this, why he would leave without any explanation. I felt a strange, cold detachment as I listened to her, my mind hardening against the pity I might have once felt for her. I told her she should have seen it coming. It wasn't like this was the first time. He had always done this, left without warning, without care. It wasn't a surprise. It was his pattern. She tried to argue, but I wasn't interested in comforting her. She was just another victim of his. I told her that she'd spent enough time pretending to be his daughter. If anything, this was long overdue. He wasn't reliable. He never had been. I told her if she wanted answers, she shouldn't ask me. She should ask her mother. It wasn't my problem anymore. Carly didn't respond immediately. Her breathing was ragged and I could hear her holding back so I didn't feel bad. I couldn't. I had been left too many times abandoned and disappointed by him. Why should I care now? She had been his stepdaughter, not even his blood. And just like me, she had gotten the short end of the stick. I ended the call. There was nothing more to say. I put the phone down with a finality that felt strange but freeing. I wasn't going to apologize for the way I had reacted. I wasn't going to apologize for cutting him off for finally saying enough was enough. Maybe Carly would understand someday. Maybe not. But that wasn't my responsibility. My responsibility was to myself, and I was putting myself first. When Matt came into the room a few moments later, he could tell something was off. He could see it in my face, hear it in my voice. He asked how it went, and I told him everything. He didn't ask me why I hadn't been more sympathetic, why I hadn't comforted Carly. He didn't tell me I should have done things differently. Instead, he just listened. He understood. He held me as I exhaled, as I felt the last of the weight I had carried for so long finally begin to lift.